Ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Italian Cultural Institute and the students of the Italian program at DePaul University, as director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, let me welcome you and thank you for joining us today and attending this webinar that marks an ideal anticipation of the Week of Italian Cuisine that will be officially open November 16th through November 22nd. I would like to thank Professor Caterina Mongiat Farina, Director of the Italian program at DePaul University, who will moderate the conversation today. I would like to thank her for her enthusiastic cooperation with the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago and for having proposed us to hold today's event. Thank you very much, Caterina. I'm honored to welcome to our virtual space Dr. Allen Grieco, Senior Research Associate Emeritus at the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa Tatti in Florence. Thank you, Allen, for being with us here today. As an historian who has focused his research and studies on the social and cultural history of food in medieval and Renaissance Italy, Dr. Grieco will talk us today about an extraordinary document and about its author. And it's a document that I really can't wait to hear about because of its historical meaning and for its many implications on multiple levels, which range from the history of food and wine itself to that of language and its use to describe the subtlety of what we perceive through our senses and the challenges that people faced and still face to describe such subtle perceptions and emotions when we taste wine or food. But before leaving the floor and the screen to our guest, I need to kindly ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in order to type your questions and not to use the chat panel on the side. And also, while Professor Grieco will be using the share screen option, I suggest that for a better experience of the webinar, you select from the view options menu on the top of your screen the side-by-side view mode. That said, Caterina, Allen, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much to Director Di Vito. It's a pleasure for our program at DePaul University to collaborate with the Italian Cultural Institute. We have a long history of collaboration, and this is truly a delightful event. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Allen Grieco, Senior Research Associate Emeritus at Villa Tatti, as we heard from Director Di Vito. This is the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. Dr. Grieco has published extensively on the cultural history of food in Italy from the 14th to the 16th centuries and co-edited several collective volumes, amongst which Food Excesses and Constraints in Europe, Special Issues of Food and History 2006, Dalla vite al vino, Fonti e problemi della vitivinicoltura italiana nel Medioevo, Bologna 1994, and Le Monde Végétal, 2e-17e siècle, Savoir et usages sociaux, for Vincennes 1993. He's co-editor of Food and History, and his latest book is entitled Food, Social Politics, and the Order of the World in Renaissance Italy, published for Harvard University Press in 2019. Most recently, he has focused on the taxonomic and classificatory systems applied to New World foodstuff. He's taught at Harvard, Università di Firenze, Università di Bologna, and created the first English language MA program at the Università delle Scienze Gastronomiche in Pollenzo, Italy, also known as the Slow Food University. So to put it mildly, he's a luminary, and it's our great honor to host him today. The Wines of Renaissance Italy, Sante Lancerio, Butler to the Pope, is a fascinating presentation that introduces us to Lancerio and will introduce us to the papal court in the mid-16th century. In particular, it introduces us to the concept of taste that I discuss very broadly with my students in the course I teach at DePaul, entitled The History, Culture, and Politics of Italian Food. As we heard from Director Di Vito, taste is that sensation of flavor that one perceives in her mouth when eating or drinking. But more broadly, it is also the ability to judge, to discern good quality based on collectively negotiated aesthetic principles. And this is something very fascinating, deep, that is going on at this time in Renaissance Italy. So again, it's my pleasure to participate in this webinar. I welcome my students and all the audience of the Italian Cultural Institute, and leave the floor to Professor Grieco.
Thank you. So before launching into the subject of today's talk, I would like to thank Caterina Monget Farina and Luca Di Vito for their invitation to give this webinar, sponsored, as you have just heard, by DePaul University and the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago. These transatlantic invitations are especially appreciated now that we're all more or less locked down. This is an opportunity for us all to escape into cyberspace, but also to stay in touch with a wider world. So thank you, Caterina, for your kind presentation, too kind presentation. Let me begin by making a point that both of you have touched on, and that might be obvious for some of you, but that cannot be taken for granted. As we all know, what might be called wine talk, more generally, especially exchanges concerning the taste of wine, is a rather contentious domain. This is often due to the fact that such exchanges pit professionals who possess a certain training and vocabulary to describe the tastes of wines against amateurs who have not mastered that vocabulary. The predictable result is that the latter often feel that the experts are just pulling the wool over their eyes. Of course, this does not mean that experts do not at times and willfully use terms that are pretentious and debatable, especially since tastes do not translate into terms accepted by all and sundry. However, that is not enough to delegitimize the technical ability of professionals to identify wines by the characteristics they discern in them. A skilled wine taster communicates using a vocabulary that is socially shared, that is a socially shared construct, or if you prefer, a meta-language that attempts to translate the sensations that can be experienced in varying degrees in tasting a wine. While descriptive wine vocabulary is not really the topic today, it is nonetheless pertinent to the 16th century document by Sante Lancerio we will be examining. So with respect to the language used to describe wine, I would like to point out that the minute anything is shared by people, no matter how small the group might be, it becomes a social and cultural phenomenon. That in turn means that it has a history, since it necessarily evolves both in time and in space, the very definition of what we do as historians. So what I would like to do today is to try and enter the network of words and ideas that Sante Lancerio, bottler to the Pope, used to communicate his understanding of the wines available to him in Rome at the time of writing this memorandum that we're discussing. Places where social exchanges are particularly intense, such as Rome, and I'm going to have the slides start. In the second half of the 16th century are typically hotbeds of innovation in practically every sense of the word. This was a period of social, religious, and urban transformation for the city. And perhaps the best example of this transformation is the very center around which the city revolved. The Vatican itself and St. Peter's Basilica were the focal point of an increasingly expanding Catholic world, and the place where Sante Lancerio served the Pope who presided over this vertiginous expansion. As bottler to the Pope, Lancerio was responsible for the papal cellar in a multi-tiered social context where food and wine played an important role. Let me remind you here that in the course of the 16th century, the population of the city grew from a scant 20,000 inhabitants after the sack of Rome in 1527 to the estimated 110,000 some 70 years later, over 5 times more. In these years, major work was undertaken on the basilical complex itself. The radical overhauling of its former medieval look that you can see in this undated print was mostly undertaken precisely in that period. And here you have more visual evidence of how it looked like based on a fresco most probably painted after 1564 when Michelangelo died, leaving the drum of the cupola and the cupola itself unfinished, but before the final burst of activity that saw it completed between 1588 and 1590. You can see the drum here, I believe. You should be able to see it in its unfinished state without the cupola, of course. The facade, of course, was completed a little later on. And here, for the sake of reminding you how that ended up, are a couple of more slides of what it looks like today. So again, the barrel in its completed form and the cupola, and of course the square itself. It's very different looking from the medieval one, though the relationship between the two should be fairly obvious. As the city grew and was transformed, so did its population evolve and diversify. The papal court and a plethora of cardinals from all over Christendom, who in turn maintained their own lesser courts, helped to make mid-16th century Rome one of the richest and most cosmopolitan centers of the world. Such a concentration of wealth and power could only bring with it a developed attention to the pleasures of life, including the variety of wines served at the tables of the rich and powerful. In more than one way, the great diversity that existed in wines provided, in fact, a sensitive barometer of social stratification. It is thanks to Sante Lancerio and an extraordinary document by his hand that we have some information about these wines served at the papal court, as well as the wines that were shunned by it. The table of the Pope needed to outshine those of the competing courts belonging to the many cardinals residing in the city. Bottler to Paul III, Pope from 1534 to 1549, Sante Lancerio is known above all for his oft-cited letter detailing some of the 55 wines sold on the Roman market, and that both he and his employer deemed particularly worthy of note. This missive was sent to not the Pope, but rather to the Pope's nephew. Yes, sorry about the slide, it's not a very good one. Cardinal Guido Ascanio Sforza in the early 1550s, and therefore just after his uncle's demise. This document is without a doubt an unicum and the first known use of what is clearly a fully developed tasting vocabulary used by a wine professional in history. It contains a tantalizing mixture of still familiar but also unfamiliar wine jargon that poses several questions. First of all, what do we know about Sante Lancerio that could shed light on how he, as a professional bottler, communicated with his audience, the Pope, but also his other readers, presumably using words that they could understand? Secondly, where did his vocabulary actually come from, since it is highly unlikely that Lancerio invented it? Thirdly, to what extent did this terminology have some kind of a logical or constructed basis, a rationale of sorts? And finally, what were the reasons for declaring a wine fit or unfit for the consumption of a given social class, as Sante so often makes a point of saying? These are lots of questions to answer in little time, but since they are interconnected, I will have to deal with them, with all of them, no matter how briefly. The first question is the easiest one to answer. We do not yet know much about Sante Lancerio, though a recent article by Daniele Lombardi has brought to light some interesting new elements. What is clear is that his so-called letter belonged to a well-known literary genre of the period. The 16th century letter was not meant to be a personal missive, as it is today, more or less, but to address a specific topic with elegant language and intriguing points. Circulated either in manuscript copies or in print, the circulation of such letters was meant to bring prestige to both its author and its addressee. Nota bene that in this case, an actual publication of the text did not come about until the 19th century. However, it bears mention that there are several manuscript copies still extant which testify to its circulation, as well as to the circulation of the terms and concepts used by the author. The second and third questions regarding the provenance of the vocabulary used by Lancerio to discuss wines and the hypothesis that these terms have a logical basis or rationale can be answered by referring to the medical literature of the time. Medical treatises contain both the vocabulary and a structural system to analyze and understand wines. I should say there's an explosion of doctors writing on wine in the 16th century. I think I've counted up at least 50 or 60 such treatises in the course of that century. This, of course, gave weight to the arguments since they were bolstered by something more than personal opinion. But these 2 points will be discussed in greater detail in just a moment. The fourth question to be answered is the rather curious way, at least for us today, in which Sante Lancerio qualifies many of the wines he discusses in terms of their supposed suitability to a given social class, physical constitution, or age group. In fact, at the end of the letter, he even provided a long list of no less than 76 wines that he lumped together, classifying them as wines that we can leave to the peasants. The answer to this last quandary is possible only after having addressed the medical criteria that subsume the world of wine and the entire system shared by Sante Lancerio and, of course, the refined consumers of his time. So let me now go on to the second part of this paper, or of this conference, and just to say that it was clear to doctors of the period that not all wines were the same. But then the question that they posed themselves was, how do you recognize the differences? Doctors, and not only doctors, as I think you're starting to understand, this is not some kind of specialized knowledge that remained in the hands of doctors, but actually also ended up in that of bottlers and yet other kinds of consumers of the period. And finally, what are the criteria for distinguishing one wine from countless other ones? So one way of going, and I've taken an example from a rather late example, so it's around 1600, that's 50 years after the document that we're looking at, but nevertheless, in that sense, not that much changed, medically speaking, or in terms of the knowledge of wines. But so Cesare Crivellati wrote a treatise on the use of wine for people that were sick, basically. And therefore, he considered it was important to be able to distinguish between different kinds of wine. And he, as he says here, having seen that there are several kinds of wine, what needs to be understood about each one of them when the word wine is used is what kind of wine we're dealing with. So he then adds, so that this can be best be revealed, I will lay down some conditions whereby men will be able to become cognizant of these different kinds of wines. So he says the first condition will be the one concerning color, since this is the quality that we discover and is made manifest before all of the other qualities. That would be true today too, wouldn't it? It must therefore be white, and remember this is a treatise for sick people. So when he says white, it's not that he's saying white is the best kind of wine. He's just saying that for sick people, white is the best kind of wine. And you will see later on why that is, because white is a cold color. And so if you're sick and you have a fever, you shouldn't be adding a hot substance to a hot body. That's basically the reasoning behind it. So anyway, he says that white is the color whereby, even though by white in everyday parlance, one can understand any color other than red and black. Now, two quick things that I would like to say is that we still do that. We still talk about white and red wines as if white wines were all the same color, which they're not, of course. And one thing that might be a little bit surprising is this introduction of the idea that there are black wines. Now, for those of you who speak Italian, you know that in Italian, that is still a distinction that's made between a dark-colored red wine and a very dark-colored one that sometimes referred to as black. In English, we don't use that that kind of terminology. And so black wines is a bit odd, but try to adapt to it. So he says, to be a little bit more specific about these white wines, he says, this does not mean that we can include the color fulvo. These are very hard to translate into English, so I had to leave it in Italian. Or flavo. Actually, they exist. These terms exist in English, but they're so recondite that even if I use them, because fulvo, for example, is fulvus. Now, I don't know how often you've used the word fulvus, but I think it's rather unlikely. But anyway, so he says, it does not mean that we can include the color fulvo or flavo, as is the case of Monzi, it's a kind of wine, Grieco, and such wines. What is meant here is cedrino or gialletto, by which I mean that they should not be too far from the color of water. Now, mind you, I have reconstructed what those colors would look like based on the descriptors that come along. I can't go into the detail, but I'm just saying that those are colors that are being mimicked through the way of writing it. So it's interesting, and I'm sorry about this slide, which is not great, but it's a detail that's blown up a little bit too much. But as you can see, a drinker here is looking at the color of the wine in transparency with a gesture that we know perfectly well because we still do it today, when, or many of us do when we raise a glass and we look at the color of the wine. So then to go back to the qualities, he says the second quality will be that of odor, which should be such that you smell little or nothing, since a powerful odor, as Galen has said, is a sure sign of great heat and of great power. So you see, this is an indication that is an important thing that we do too today. So when we taste the wine, the second instinct after looking at the color is precisely that one, to smell, to see what bouquet is. And here again, I've taken from another Taquinum Sanitatis these are actually somewhat earlier than the writing of Sante Lancerio. You see here we have a person who's clearly smelling the wine, not drinking it, because the glass is significantly above the mouth of the drinker. Furthermore, this is an illustration for a wine which is vinum rubeum grossum, so it's a powerful red wine. And these powerful red wines were characterized precisely by the fact that they had a strong bouquet, a very pronounced bouquet. So that's, again, shows you a continuity in the way in which wines are tasted from the Middle Ages up to now, even before the Renaissance. So tastes cannot be illustrated in the way that I've just done up to now, but they were classified on a graduated scale. And I'm just going to show you how that is, how that works, because the graduated scale is basically goes from hot to cold via the temperate. So you have these, between these two opposites, you have all the different tastes that were recognized in the Renaissance, which are not the same as the ones we see today. Now in Italian, the terms are, as you are moving down from the hot end of the spectrum to the cold one via the temperate, they go from acre to amaro, salato, grasso, etc. And I've offered you a translation into modern English here, which is not totally satisfactory, but just to give you an idea of what those tastes might be. In Italian, most of the tastes are still current, except for maybe acre and maybe brusco is not very well known, or austero are not terms that are used very much. In English, it's hard to translate, as you can imagine. But as it turns out, in fact, all of these terms did have translations. And I'm just going to show you how that works. And it's not only in Italian, it works, you know, and there's aceto, sorry, which is the coldest of the tastes, which is quite literally unripe. But as I was saying, the terms, as it turns out, were also known in other European languages. And I'm sorry. Okay, and so I'm giving you the equivalents in Italian and English and French. Of course, these are 16th century terms. So, for example, brisk or brusque in English doesn't really exist anymore. Or acrid, we don't speak of acrid wines. But in the 16th century, people knew exactly what that meant. And of course, that's not surprising, because all of these terms, whether they're in Italian, in English, or in French, are all derived ultimately from Latin, which was the language that doctors used to write in and to communicate in. So that is an explanation for how this works. Okay. And here you have the whole gamut of the terms that were used. As you can see, it goes way beyond the 4 or 5 tastes that we usually recognize today as being the basic taste that from which everything is then derived. Okay, but now let's go back to the question of colors. And I'm just going to try to keep track of time here, because it's easy to forget. Yes. So back to the question of colors. I don't really have the time to go into as much detail as with the taste, but let me just say that, again, the colors of wine were put on a humoral scale, much in the way that we have just seen. So when they went from hot to temperate to cold wines, colors of wines. So all things being equal, some colors are hotter and some colors are colder. Okay. So using the colors that we know today, so that we don't get confused, except for that black that continues to pester us in English, we go from very dark wines to less dark wines. And as you can see, as we're coming down, we get to the darker red, to the red, to the clarets, which were, of course, a big deal in the 16th century. Well, from the Middle Ages all the way up to the 18th century, clarets were considered to be the best wines. But then we go to other registers, to vin gris or vino grigio, to dark yellow wines, such as can be almost brown, oxidized wines, vin santo, vin de paille, chateau Yquem. You see the register that I'm talking about roughly. And then, of course, you have the more white wines, that very imprecise term that I don't like to use, but to make it simple, I'm using it now. So you have yellow wines that might have be very light yellow, have green tinges. Anyway, all kinds of possibilities. Finally, almost white wines, the very transparent ones that we today would say are wines that were made with very little oxidation. Okay, so, but the point is, this is how we would categorize with the humoral scale of the period, using our sort of everyday knowledge of colors of wine. In this period, though, people felt that, or doctors certainly felt and convinced a lot of other people that that was not quite enough. And so they tended to look for tools that were more adapted to doing an analysis of wine. Now, this is going to sound a little bit odd to you, but one of the ways of doing it was to apply the this image that you have now in front of you is an image of what's usually referred to. It's a bit unappetizing, especially at this time, but it's a urine wheel, and so this is basically a way for classifying the color of different urines when they were being examined by doctors to make sure that somebody was sick or not sick or what situation he was in. As you will probably understand, it also involves blood, because on the right-hand side, for example, we have a whole bunch of colors that seem a bit fanciful, but actually they it's that the original support has made them vary a little bit, and so that's not the exact colors that we're looking at. But in any case, this wheel did offer a whole bunch of, and as you can see around the side, a whole bunch of very finely observed colors that then could be used to sort of equate with the wines. So in particular, I think I counted 16 different types of white, or yellow if you prefer, that could be applied to wines, and some 6 or 7 reds. But all of these, so in other words, the characteristics that the urines would have had were also the characteristics that the wine would have had. And some were better and some were worse. So the ones that beginning at the bottom left and bottom right are the worst. The ones that are at the top left and right are the ones that are best, or were considered by doctors to be best. This urine wheel was so commonly used that I just wanted to show you, this is called a belt book. And these were books, literally books that were hung on the clothing of doctors, their belts, that they could then flip open to check that they had that they remember correctly what the colors were. And this is, so on the left you have the belt book, what it looked like, and on the right, when you opened it up, that's what you got as a result. Each page then had other kinds of information, but just to say how commonly used this terminology was, and so it probably was quite easy to make that jump to wine and apply the same terminology to wine. Okay, so let me just say 2 more words before I'm going to stop the share quickly. I'm just going to say a couple of words about how this system worked. So basically, and I have to simplify, I have to go quickly now. The ideal wine, and therefore the wine for the best kind of customers, the richest, the wealthiest, the most powerful, etc., had to be more or less in the middle of the system. So nothing excessive, it had to be temperate. So the tastes in the middle of the system that we have just seen, and the colors, same thing, in the middle, not, and now I showed you a round way of portraying those colors. But imagine opening it up and having the cold colors at the bottom and the hot ones at the top. And where you saw the top of the wheel, I'm sorry, this is a bit confusing, but where you saw the top of the wheel would have been right in the middle of that whole scheme. So this is what you were trying to aim for, right? So now I'm just going to very rapidly take a look at a couple of examples and conclude with that. So let me go back into the shared screen. And there we go. So back to Sante Lancerio and what he says about wines. So to give you two examples, well, one articulated one and one a little bit less. When he speaks of one of the wines, one of the 55 wines that he's analyzing, he takes the Grieco della Torre and he begins, I'm not quoting the whole thing because it's a bit long. He says, this is wine that comes from a place of the same name, not far from Naples and close to the sea. The wines here vary according to the year. In a bad year, they change color and turn black, but in a good year, they are good. So you see, that already is a bit of a problem because it means that that's a wine that is not stable and that we don't really know what its humoral entity is, and therefore it poses a problem. Its changing color means that its very nature is also being changed. And you'll see now in just a second how that has all kinds of consequences. He then goes on, and I think this is also very significant. He says, but in a good year, they are good. So in other words, in a good year, they stay the same color and they're therefore good. So color is an important factor. He then says, these are not wines for lords and prelates, but rather ones for servants. Familia, he uses the term, and for bakers. Well, that's pretty specific. That's a very specific social group. And then he adds, as if it were necessary, of such wines, his sanctity never wanted to partake. So, in other words, color is an important factor. And let me just show you something that is maybe surprising, but shouldn't be at this point, is that I want to show you an example of what I would say was almost a kind of a commercial fraud in the 16th century that was precisely based on these theories we have just illustrated. So, and again, this comes from Sante Lancerio. When he discusses the wines that come from Spain, he says, the wines that come from Spain are red ones. They're very dark colored, carichi is the term he uses. So in order to take care of this, they're loaded with a great quantity of plaster, gesso. As a concept, by the way, that is a custom that continued all the way into the 19th century. So to modify colors of wine by using plaster. As a consequence of this addition, they become less dark and acquire a beautiful color, even though this practice is very bad for both the stomach and the body. So in other words, you modify the color because you know that the market is going to buy that. That's something that's having found a remedy to a problem that feeds into the presuppositions of the people who are buying. And again, he adds, of course, of such wines his sanctity did not want to ever partake. So that, I think, is a kind of a proof to what extent color was an important factor that consumers of the period, or at least some consumers of the period, would have been very sensitive to and been very careful to observe. Finally, and this is just sort of for fun because I could go on for a long time still, just another wine, Il Mangiaguerra. The write-up that he gives this wine is particularly interesting. He says, this is a wine that comes from the Kingdom of Naples, and it is a red wine. This kind of wine is very sweet and very dark colored. Again, he uses the term carico. It is a powerful wine that is very matroso. This is a term I have not been able to quite understand. And appellative. Appellative is a term that is used by doctors in this period. And I won't translate it for you because it's not very polite to even use the modern word for it. Anyway, these are wines for innkeepers and for drunkards. So you see, that's, again, very precise social group. Some of them are not quite that powerful or that dark. So the courtiers and prelates can also drink them. So you see, the color is almost what's determining who can consume or not consume that wine. But then he adds, but on the whole, there are wines for courtesans to incite lust. So you see, the color there again is playing an incredibly important role. I could go on and give you examples also of how tastes are the same way. So hot tastes, such as acrid wines, are again for courtesans and incite lust, or cold wines are sort of morally correct wines. But I think we don't have much more time this evening, and I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So at this point, I'd like to thank you. And above all, I hope that the color of the wine in this wonderful image, painting of Carracci, Annibale Carracci, will speak to you and not look like a sort of an anemic wine the way we would normally be looking at it today. Let's try to look at it with the eyes of a 16th century bottler of the Pope. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Grieco for such fascinating escape into Renaissance wines. One thing that really struck my attention is this idea that the wine for the upper classes had to be temperate. So distinction comes from moderation, balance, and not from excess. It's something that can sound novel to us. And also the Mandrake Root by Machiavelli came to mind, where the protagonist, who poses as a doctor, in fact inspects the urine of Lucrezia, a woman that is trying to seduce, and prescribes a potion of mandrake root, which in fact is wine. So we can see that many of the things that Professor Grieco mentioned are in a way fluctuating in the culture of the Renaissance in various genres. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. We're getting many interesting ones in our Q&A. The first one I would like to ask is from Richard Shepro, who writes, does Sante Lancerio discuss what wines are appropriate for what foods, dishes? If not, do you think there were rules that were unwritten, or were wines matched to the social class and medical condition of the drinker and not to the dish?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it's something that has been debated quite a bit. But on the whole, I don't think that the abbinamento, the idea that somehow you had to have the right wine for the right food, really worked in this period, except, and there is a kind of an exception, which is that possibly, since you always have to somehow balance things, so maybe eating particularly cold foods might have required hot wines, or hotter wines, let's put it that way. But there was no matching the way we think there is matching, which I think there again, that's a very social and cultural construct, because until recently, white wines were absolutely consumed with fish, and now that rule is sort of out of the window. So there are no absolutes. It's just, it's usage.
Thank you. Another question asked by Anna Reed is, did peasants have access to this ideal wine as identified by doctors for medical purposes, or was access to wines like those for medical use or not restricted to elites?
Well, I'd like to cite a short story by Franco Sacchetti. And Franco Sacchetti has this wonderful story of these upper-class Florentines who are drinking Trebbiano in some tavern. And one of the drinkers says, "We should bless the hands of those who made this wine, who will never drink this wine. And as we will instead be doing in just 1 second." And his friend, it's a beffa, it's making fun of him, says, "No, you're not going to drink." And he grabs the glass and drinks it himself. But it's significant because it shows to what extent, in fact, the peasants did not drink upper class wines, also because they're far more expensive. And if they had any, if they produced it, they sold it, because with the revenue they could buy the necessities of life and not the pleasures.
Thank you. Another student of mine, Eva Noble, asks if winemaking was uniform, or if the techniques for making wine vary between farmers. Did this affect the perceived quality of the wine?
That's a complicated question to answer easily, but certainly there were techniques that they knew about, and precisely the Trebbiano that I was talking about just a second ago, which was a wine that was slightly sweet from what we understand, required a whole way of preparing it that was mastered only by certain people. So, and I'm sure there were other kinds of wines. The evidence is a little bit difficult to come by, but no, and also the fact that, of course, some wines were made with certain grapes rather than others, etc. So no, there was an idea of producing variety for a market that required that kind of variety. And Rome, of course, was a bit of a center for that, but Florence and other important cities, or for example, Venice too, would have had a pretty thriving wine market with variety being offered, and producers had to provide what was selling.
Fascinating. And here I'm going to ask two questions. One from Mirka Benes, who asks, how much did Romans drink local wines from the local vineyards, the vigne around Rome? And from Lucia Marchi, who writes, as a native of Piacenza, I'm curious to know if Lancerio mentions any wine from the hills around the city, now quite famous, especially in line with Paul III's giving of the Duchy of Parma and Piacenza to the Farnese in 1545. So it seems that our participants are interested in knowing if this kind of doc, so the origin of the wine, was important for the drinkers of wine.
Okay, to answer the first question, on the whole, the wines produced in Rome or around Rome were not considered very high. In fact, the 76 that I mentioned as being wines for the peasants, they were mostly wines from these regions. But having said that, of course, there were the vineyards, the vigne that were owned by certain cardinals and so on. And there, I think, they probably produced with grape varieties that were selected, et cetera, but those didn't necessarily get on the market. So the document we have doesn't help us to see that. We have a sort of a general picture. He does at times say, this is wine that is produced by Cardinal so-and-so in his vineyard in such and such a place. And he used to send every year a few bottles to the Pope, and the Pope appreciated very much those bottles. So you see, I can't generalize to answer that question. And the second one about, what was it, Pavia?
Piacenza.
Piacenza, sorry. I don't remember anything about the wines of Piacenza, but it's hard to keep in mind all of these different wines and all of what he says about them. So, well, I mean, you know, it's fairly easy to get a hold of a copy of Sante Lancerio. So I think anybody who wants to do it should just try to get a hold of a copy and look through it and find their own hometown and feel happy that it's mentioned. Certainly that's what I did, because I live in an area where the Trebbiano was produced. Nobody knows about it anymore, but it's sort of nice to look out of the window and say, well, they used to have a great wine here.
Thank you so much. So I want to be very mindful of our time. It's 12:29 here in Chicago and 7 hours ahead in Florence, where Dr. Grieco is calling us from. And so I would like to invite back the director of the Italian Cultural Institute if he wishes to say a few parting words. And I thank you both, and I also thank our audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grieco. Thank you very much, Caterina. Actually, I have one. I'm picking up a question that I'm seeing that on the chat of our attendees is something that is raising a lot of curiosity, and actually regarding the word matroso, which I imagine is difficult to relate to any term we use today, but I imagine you must have investigated or tried to investigate its etymology or its its connection to wines.
Yeah, well, I have, but I'm afraid I didn't come up with much. Certainly, has nothing to do with mother. That's certainly not. It might have something to do with rocky, because Matros was a kind of a rock. But then why would it be that? It's a bit unclear. But next time we meet, I might have an answer to that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So once again, Dr. Grieco, it's been a very interesting and fascinating conversation, because you have shed light on a vast territory that most of us ignore completely, and it's really fascinating to hear about it. And I'm sure that many of us are left with the curiosity to investigate more. And as you mentioned at the end of your lecture, we will definitely, it was the same thing I was thinking, we will definitely look at Renaissance pictures from now on. And when we see a wine, we will be able to use the list of terms, even the less used one, like austero, to describe it, to interpret paintings as well. Professor Caterina Mongiat-Farina, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a delight to cooperate with you. It's been the first time, of course, since I took office here in Chicago that we work together, in the cooperation between the Cultural Institute and the Italian and DePaul University dates back to a long time. I'm sure we'll work again in the future and share our activities and programs. So
thank you.
I would also
thank you, all of you.
I would finally like to thank you all for attending, and I hope you will be able to see each other soon, starting from next week within the frame of the Italian week, the week of the Italian cuisine. We will have a film screening related to food. We'll have a lecture about food at the time of Raphael, as this year we celebrate the 500th anniversary from the death of Raphael. We will also celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of Pellegrino Artusi, a monument of Italian of dissemination of recipes in Italian families. And as well, another celebration, because next week will mark the 10 years of introduction of the Mediterranean diet within the list of World Intangible Heritage by UNESCO. So you will be able to find all these events and information about this on our website of Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago and our social media. So hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much again to our guests. And until then, stay safe, wear masks on both sides of the ocean, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.